Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by the Spectator's political editor Katy and Sophia Gaston, head of the foreign policy unit at Policy Exchange. Now Katy, this morning Keir Starmer gave a big press conference with Olaf Scholz, his German counterpart in Berlin. It's all part of a 2-day sort of love-bombing effect of going across the European continent capitals and trying to win them over and talk about Labour's mission in government for winning over European partners. Tell us more about his new big treaty with Germany.
So the purpose of the visit, as you allude to, is effectively, we know that the Labour Party, now the Labour government, wants to have closer ties with Europe. They've been fairly upfront about some of that, in the sense of, you've heard them talk about how they think it makes geographical sense in a changing world, particularly on security when you look at where America might go, I suppose, in terms of protectionism, but also where the focus could be on security more towards China than perhaps to Ukraine, seeing what happens with Taiwan. And then also, if you look at some of the partners you might rely on, the Labour argument goes, well, we should hug those who are closest, and Europeans are like-minded, and we can reverse some of the bad blood from Brexit just by having a more positive rhetoric and exchange. So there have been various visits so far, and I think this visit to Germany, obviously before Keir Starmer then goes to the Paralympics, and it will also meet Emmanuel Macron, is being centred around this idea of this new trade treaty, this new general cooperation on several levels. But I think there's a question as to what is Labour trying to do more widely on Brexit. Scholz and Keir Starmer, I think, are probably the closest to having a bromance of the European leaders. They've met many times at this point. I think the German press just said, they're both seen as being a bit dull. Perhaps that's why they get on so well. That's what one German paper mused a few months ago. And, they are both social democrats. They have similar politics. One is doing a lot better in the polls currently than the other. And when it comes to this, treaty with Germany, it's interesting that they set the timetable for 6 months. I think partly because at the moment, at least, it seems ambitious that Scholz will necessarily be there, in a year or so's time. So there is a reason to act quickly. But where there can be cooperation on these things, is this part of a wider reset whereby you're going to start to try and get to commission level? Because if you want to have big changes in terms of how we trade with the EU, that's where you need to get to. And that's when you get to concessions, which currently Downing Street does not want to talk about.
And Sophia, that point about the kind of Brexit negotiations, what happens, obviously the deal comes up in 2026. We were talking before the podcast about how Keir Starmer actually, if you look at kind of a lot of different metrics, has a huge Labour majority, has public opinion on his side for kind of having more pro-EU measures. You look at a sort of youth mobility scheme. How far can he really go in kind of not potentially rejoining the European Union, but actually getting much closer to Europe without kind of antagonising those fears that you could get to a position where Labour was in the late 2010s when actually Brexit was a real weakness for them? How can he kind of make Europe a virtue for the Labour Party as he tries to fulfil his domestic goals?
We've got two barriers. You've got the domestic barrier here. The political Overton window on Brexit hasn't actually really caught up to where a lot of public opinion is at, and of course where Labour's enormous majority in Parliament is actually at. But these are the political realities, and I think Starmer is credibly concerned that should he scare the horses on Europe and getting too close with the EU, that will become the story of his entire first term, and it will suck all their energy away, and he will end up being sort of, in this vortex that Brexit has consumed so many other different prime ministers over the last several decades. So I think he's trying to avoid that, partly because he wants to get a lot of things done domestically. But at the same time, so much of his domestic agenda is contingent on things like growth, energy security, dealing with this crisis around irregular migration. And for that, he actually needs some help from our European partners. So there's this kind of interesting matrix here that he has to, a very tight tightrope that he has to navigate very deftly. I think that the reality is that we are going to move closer to the EU position on several areas and deal with some of the low-hanging fruit around the EU relationship in this parliamentary term. But I think they will be really rigid around that single market and customs union red line. And what that means is you have to look for all the other sort of creative solutions. I think what's really interesting is a lot of the groundwork for this German relationship has actually been laid through the UK-France summit that was actually held when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister last year, in those sort of halcyon moments after the Windsor Framework was unlocked. And that summit, behind the scenes, was really interesting because we actually got to see the areas in which France was willing to move on that perhaps in public had been considered red lines and wouldn't even engage in those conversations when the negotiations were taking at an EU level. So I think what that's shown to the British system is that the politics of this is really important. Yes, there are limitations to what you can do outside of the EU and the TCA, but there are some things that can be massaged around the margins, particularly in terms of inward investment, attracting, German businesses to invest, German defense companies to invest, R&D, all sorts of things that you can do outside of the TCA that don't step on those red lines, but can actually help to drive economic growth in those kind of key domestic agendas.
Yeah, I mean, Katy, one of the things that Sophia's written about today is actually about how traditionally the challenge within the British government has been integrating the kind of foreign mission with the domestic mission. And the line that jumped out to me from Keir Starmer's press conference today was saying, growth is my number one mission. And of course, it sounded just like yesterday's press conference in Downing Street Garden, where he talked about wealth creation. And so it's unusual to have kind of messages for a purely domestic political audience talking about economic growth at home, really in a foreign context. I mean, does Labour really see that the way in which it can boost its growth mission is by doing these kind of foreign deals abroad and actually trying to do things around the margins and thinking creatively, as Sophia says, with Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general view in Labour, and you've got to remember, every member of the cabinet backed staying in the EU, and a large part of that argument was an economic argument. Pretty sure there's some who also, within Labour feel not an almost romantic attachment, perhaps, to the EU in terms of what it represents, in terms of working together. But the main argument in that referendum was it is going to be economically problematic to leave the EU. You follow logic, and many Labour politicians take the view that closer relations with the EU in terms of working together on markets, in terms of attracting investment, is where they need to go. I think that also because this Labour government, as far as I can tell, has very little interest in diverging, it does slightly beg the question, does Keir Starmer want to do much with Brexit powers? Now, you can argue the last Tory government didn't do that much with the Brexit powers, but I think particularly, when you think about what will the EU want in certain countries, I think aligning, whether you call it, alignment, whether you find a different way to dress it up and the UK just magically happens to have the exact same standards as the EU and various other things. That is something I don't think most Labour politicians would break too much of a sweat about. Whereas if we are talking about the Tory parliamentary party, this idea of free trade deals and where you can get ahead and perhaps what it means, in terms of certain crops and GINA, all this, that's the kind of thing where they would want to have a big conversation about it. Because that's not where the Labour Party is, I agree with Sophie, they don't want to talk about the customs union because it feels like a big step and people at home might have known what it is and does that look like you are reversing Brexit? But you can get pretty close to things around that, and that's not, something which I think the Labour government is too worried about. I think where the Labour government is concerned is anything that looks like it's resembling freedom of movement. You think about where the Reform Party is at the moment, when it comes to the seats where they probably came second in the general election. Lots of them that, particular places in the north, what we might call the red wall seats, some of those, it's Reform that's in second place. And you see Labour have dropped a few points. Obviously, they've got 4 and a bit years to get those points back or to lose more, depending. But they dropped a few points and they seem to be going to the Reform Party, not to the Tory Party. Not to the Lib Dems. And therefore, I think, when Keir Starmer talks about battling populism and so forth, they're not going to want to do much which, gives into perception that they're not controlling immigration. And you can see that in the current discussions, be it with Germany and other countries, because what would Scholz and others like? They would like this youth mobility scheme whereby you could have under 30s coming to the UK and vice versa. It's what most of the member states would like. And yet you have had Downing Street repeatedly say, we're not doing this. I think Downing Street are also saying they won't do Erasmus, which is obviously the university scheme. I was speaking to a few Tory MPs last night. They were saying, even we are okay with Erasmus. But I think, there's obviously a question on university funding on Erasmus, but I think it also just speaks to a fear in Labour that as soon as you get to anything that looks like it could be, edging into freedom of movement or a path back to it, that's when they get to the voter backlash. But there is going to be a restraining force in terms of the parameters of how far you can go on these things.
Just on the youth mobility scheme, I think Brussels made it, there was an error in that being launched out into the stratosphere during the election campaign. I think anticipating a Labour victory and anticipating that would mean they would want to act quickly on these sorts of things. In reality, Labour is being extremely cautious for all the reasons that Katy has outlined. But I really think that these, particularly the under 30s mobility scheme, and again, that is something that came up in the UK-France summit as well. Why is the EU, why are EU member states so interested in that? Well, it's because it was actually a very beneficial thing for their young people to come to the UK, to live in a free and prosperous society, to contribute, to get some really good work experience, in a globally competitive way, and to learn English. Right? So that actually was very valuable for the EU member states, which is why they're very interested in it as well. With Erasmus, I think everybody just believes in that as a common good, that research and academic collaboration. And so that's actually quite popular in public opinion as well. I think we will get to both of those things over time, but I really strongly believe that the Starmer government does not think that it is going to be possible for them to move to those things until they can project a feeling of grip on the irregular migration problem, which is, again, something that they feel they need to unlock with the EU.
And one of those key points about shared interests as well, which they're talking about today, about sharing intelligence, etc. Just to say also, defence was a key cornerstone of today's talks and summit as well. They talked about Ukraine and kind of the UK and Germany on that standing together. You wrote today, Sophia, about how Germany has really sort of changed its defence posture since the invasion of Ukraine at the beginning of February 2022. Talk about sort of defence going forward. You say as part of the integration of the kind of the domestic and foreign mission, one of the things hopefully that Whitehall is hoping for is going to be about how the UK sort of defence companies, defence industry can kind of get involved in the EU going forward. Tell us about that.
One of the dividends, if we can call it, the outcomes of the appalling situation of the war in Ukraine has been to show and really reinforce how important that Britain is as a security actor in the European region. And we have a really outstanding defense industry here of primes, SMEs. It's very textured. We've got a lot of brilliant tech companies that are integrating in. So we've got a real jewel in the crown here. And obviously there's some really important companies in Germany, Italy, France, and so on. But we've got a really good integrated system. So the fact that it is currently actually punitive for British firms to engage in the kind of EU defense industrial base at the moment is just absurd and totally unsustainable. And this is actually one of those issues where it's the EU that really needs to move. So at the moment, they've got this whole system that's designed to be very punitive towards third parties, and we're classified as one of these sort of third countries, which, given our very, very important role in Ukraine and how we've proven ourselves to be extremely effective and decisive actors there, that's just unsustainable. And I think a lot of people in other European capitals understand that. So really in the longer term, that's the big piece that needs to be nutted out. And I think there is a feeling that if we can make some serious progress at a bilateral level, particularly with a country like Germany, that can start to pave the way for us to have some of those conversations in the EU level. It's not going to necessarily one lead to the other straight away, but it does move the ship in the right direction. It's also true that Germany is a country that's been through this extraordinary shift, the Zeitenwende. It's trying to develop a national security culture, which it hasn't had for some time, for obvious historical reasons. And now we're in a very different landscape, and Germany is an incredibly important economy and manufacturer and defense agent. So there's a lot of mutual benefits for us working more closely with Germany. I think we've got a lot to teach them, and I think they've also got a lot to teach us in terms of modernization of the military and things like that. So all in all, I think it's a win-win for us to get closer here, and hopefully that also encourages Brussels to move and open up a bit more on the longer-term project of EU cooperation.
And he'll be hoping as well that his tete-a-tete with Mr. Macron goes equally well as it did with Olaf Scholz today. Thank you very much, Sophia. Thank you, Katy. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.